Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd first like to thank the Atlantic Treaty Association for this unique opportunity to address the distinguished young potential leaders of our future. When I was on active duty, and that has been quite some time now since I left, I did not recall the existence of such a wonderful initiative as this in the Alliance, including young minds in Alliance activities at an early stage may be considered a very good NATO investment. And I congratulate those who have created it. I'm certain that in the long run, the crops will be excellent. And I want to start with a few words on the history of how NATO evolved. I'm certain that you all know very well the history of events which led to the founding of the Atlantic Alliance. But nonetheless, as the saying goes, nothing is said enough until it is repeated enough. 5 days ago, it was the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. For a moment, I'll ask you to think about the period right after the war. A devastated Europe with more than 26 million people dead, disabled, homeless, and at the brink of starvation. As this wasn't enough, East European countries fell one by one to Soviet occupation and communist regimes. And during all this was happening, what was the situation in Turkey? Well, to be frank, Turkey fared comparatively well, because by declaring armed neutrality, she had managed to stay out of the war. However, this was not without any cost. Neutrality also meant isolation. As the victorious Allies were rapidly demobilizing, the Soviet Red Army did not follow suit. Instead, they massed forces on Turkey's eastern borders and made some threatening territorial demands, namely for 2 eastern Turkish provinces on the Soviet border, as well as basic rights and joint control on the Turkish Straits. Response to these Soviet demands was a blunt no, but we had about 13 wars with the Russians in the past, and we were at the brink of the next one. While Turkey was preparing against Soviet aggression, at this juncture, Western allies realized that unless measures were taken, the domino theory effect would swallow what was left of free Europe. It was decided to provide military assistance to Turkey and Greece, who was fighting a civil war against communist guerrillas. At this stage, as a gesture of solidarity, on the 5th of April of 1946, the American battleship USS Missouri brought to Istanbul the remains of the Turkish ambassador in Washington, His Excellency Münir Ertegun, who had passed away 16 months earlier. This was a strong message to the USSR. By destiny, 32 years prior to that date, in 1914, another warship, the German heavy cruiser Goeben, which laid anchor in Istanbul, had brought Turkey into the First World War. Now, this new ship was there to help Turkey avoid an undesired new one. As tensions continued to rise due to Soviet expansionist threats, Western Allied statesmen who had experienced 2 world wars this time were determined to prevent a new one. And the only way to achieve the same was to build deterrence by creating a united front of defense through solidarity. Evidently, possession of nuclear weapons by only one side was quite a contribution to the deterrence. At the outset, there was no southern flank. For some time, the obvious threats from the direction were somehow disregarded. it was only after heated political discussions among transatlantic and European allies, Turkish contribution to the Korean War, and the fighting qualities of the Turkish soldier was tested in combat that Turkey and also Greece, which was facing threats from the Balkans, finally became members in 1952. Turkey's accession to NATO was vital for her security in that critical period, and today, NATO still remains indispensable for Turkey. But here I must also stress that Turkey is indispensable for NATO as well. Throughout the Cold War period, NATO's main mission remained unchanged: deterrence and collective defense. Naturally, over the years, new strategic concepts were adopted as conditions required. Command and force structures were constantly upgraded, modified to meet new challenges. It was this great flexibility and agility of NATO which eventually paved the way to ending the expensive arms race between the blocs and winning the Cold War without firing a single shot in anger. When the Warsaw Pact dissolved, the Berlin Wall came down, and the USSR dispersed, most people were relieved. Finally, the long-awaited peace was here to stay. Some politicians and academics even started to question the validity of the alliance, because if no threat was left, then NATO ought to be dissolved. But it soon became obvious that time was not yet ripe for such optimism. This period was indeed short-lived. In the 90s, the international community had to look upon NATO to resolve two crises which erupted in the Balkans after the disintegration of Yugoslavia, namely Bosnia and Kosovo, peacekeeping and peace enforcement operations. These were succeeded by hitherto unprecedented events, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which led to activation of Article 5 of the Alliance Treaty for the first and only time in NATO till to date. The Alliance was facing a new set of hybrid threats, risks, uncertainties, which were hard to identify or predict. At first, the intelligence community was baffled. Nothing looked in place. There was so much uncertainty and unpredictability. In the military, we were all used to dealing with divisions, brigades, tanks, aircraft, ships, missiles, etc., and to look for their whereabouts. In other words, we knew much about conventional military threats, but these new types looked totally different. The new challenge had to be rapidly met. Terrorism was beginning to pose a real and serious threat to the security and safety of the alliance and its members. So NATO, once again, had to show its flexibility in adapting itself to this new dangerous environment. Over the last couple of years, NATO had to deal with the war in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, the products of Arab Spring, or maybe I should say Arab Winter, Libya, Syria, and of course the situation in the Ukraine and Crimea. ISIS in Iraq and Syria, on the other hand, is on the waiting list. So where do we stand at the moment? In my view, dangers for NATO and Europe are on the rise and increasingly becoming global in nature. Some intellectuals may be inclined to think that Europe is still safe and sound. But is that really true anymore? We should ask this question to people from the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, a Crimean Tatar, an Italian Coast Guard sailor, a Turkish sentry on the Syrian border, or perhaps a Central Asian Turkic state citizen, and hear what they will have to say. Imperial and irredentist instincts are once again awakening in Russia as the regime turns more authoritarian. We should also not ignore the unresolved European long-term interim Balkan solutions, the unresolved issues in Moldova, Georgia, and the Karabakh problem between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This list will not be completed if we do not add some long-term hazards that may be encountered by the alliance. natural resource shortages and energy security, terrorism, insurmountable refugee and asylum seeker problems stemming from out-of-area civil wars, overpopulation, unemployment, climate change, ethnic and religious issues, narcotic smuggling, criminal and terrorist use of cyberspace and cyber attacks, piracy, maritime safety and security, proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction, and EU internal problems. Therefore, we may come to the conclusion that Europe and the alliance, after all, is not very safe and sound, and Europe's security problems are not resolved. Against this background, it is clear that NATO is not obsolete, and it will survive for a long time to come. It is more indispensable than it ever was, and without any doubt, it is the most powerful defense alliance ever formed in the world. It reaches out to 70 countries across the globe through its members and partners as a contributor to peace and security. Yet, there remains much more to be done to promote NATO's image both at home, that is within NATO and European nations, and abroad. Citizens of welfare states living far away from international trouble spots tend to distance themselves from security issues. They need to be convinced about the relevance of the alliance and why their governments have to keep spending money for defense. Luckily, Putin bolstered the alliance more than anybody else could. And this is a quotation from Professor Karl-Heinz Kamp, a former director of research at the NATO Defense College. And there's also a Turkish proverb, which more or less can be translated as one calamity is better than 1,000 advice. So public diplomacy, public information, public relation efforts must be maximized to reinforce popular support. We cannot always rely on Mr. Putin to unite us. Let us now take a look at the topics that might be agenda items at the ministerial, which will start tomorrow. That is the real one. During summit meetings, heads of state and government make decisions and task their ministers of foreign affairs and ministers of defense to monitor the work of the officials on their behalf. Therefore, ministerial meeting agenda items for discussion normally include, but may not be limited to, progress reports prepared by NATO authorities on summit decisions. One doesn't need to have a crystal ball to guess what the ministers are going to talk about. Examination of the NATO Summit declaration held in Wales, United Kingdom last fall may give indications about issues that are likely to be discussed. My own forecasts would include the following: the situation in Ukraine, obviously, and NATO's policy towards Russia, progress on the Readiness Action Plan and expansion of the NATO response force to strengthen NATO's collective defense and crisis management capability, activation of an interim spearhead force, a rapid joint task force, actually, about 5,000 men. Dangers posed by the extremists from the south of Turkey, the Syria, Iraq, and ISIS. Situation in Afghanistan after the termination of ISAF, the ballistic missile defense, interim operational capabilities and command control arrangements, cyberspace and cyber defense issues, and perhaps Iran's nuclear program, as agreement signing date, the 30th of June, is coming closer. Now, of course, certainly there may be other topics to be added, but so much for the ministerial. Well, ladies and gentlemen, NATO is now 66 years old. I don't know if any other alliance in history has lasted this long. As long as threats and risks against our common values of individual liberty, democracy, rule of law, and human rights persist, our alliance will get older and older. Those brave men who found NATO are no longer alive, but the foundation they laid remains very robust. Our common values will remain unchanged. No matter how serious or dangerous the challenges that we face might be, we must be prepared and determined to protect them at all costs, and your turn is not too far to shoulder the oncoming responsibilities. As the alliance gets older, it seems that its leaders get younger. In my view, that is a promising sign because it implies that the future of NATO is going to be more agile, energetic, and if leaders of the future are given the opportunity to acquire experience in international relations and defense and security-related subjects at earlier stages in their careers, when they come to responsible positions, their evaluations and decisions may be more comprehensive, courageous, faster, and, if needed, bolder. I'm sure each one of you can show examples of such leaders from your own national history, but the example I'm going to give will be from Turkish history. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was promoted to the rank of Major General on the battlefield at the age of 34. He was 40 when he was a Field Marshal, again 6 years later, again on the battlefield. And 2 years after that, he became the founder of the Turkish Republic and the first president at the age of 42. A very quick rise, but well-deserved. To conclude my remarks, the title of this panel is interesting. What this ministerial means for NATO. Well, first of all, in my view, NATO is showing its trust to the younger generation. At the same time, NATO is using this opportunity to inform future potential leaders and experts about current and defense-related issues, enabling them to discuss the topics among themselves, make evaluations, draw lessons, and gain knowledge. As I said in my opening remarks, this is a very profitable investment on NATO's part, and actually it's a win-win situation for both NATO and the young participants. For NATO, it's a well-thought opportunity to promote the alliance image, as young participants get to know the alliance and hopefully return home with positive impressions. Like a pebble thrown into the still water, those impressions may expand. In the long term, or perhaps even sooner, NATO may see them holding responsible positions. For the participants, what better way than to gain first-hand knowledge and experience about the alliance and self-preparation for a future career. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few last recommendations from an old soldier. You must understand and analyze very critical challenges our world is facing and prepare yourselves to overcome them when the time comes. In the not too distant future, some of you will be holding responsible positions in either NATO or national capacity to sustain this alliance and preserve its vitality. Lethargy and indifference erodes deterrence and the instinct of national defense, thus raising the appetite of the aggressors and terrorists. Our societies need to be better informed about risks and threats and the NATO alliance. Black propaganda is abundant targeting NATO, and this is particularly true for my own nation. Public information efforts must be increased to correct this decline. The principle of collective defense is at the heart of NATO's founding treaty. It remains unique and enduring principle that binds its members together, committing them to protect each other and setting a spirit of solidarity within the alliance. Now, I borrowed this definition from the NATO website. To make it simpler, I will ask you to remember Alexander Dumas' famous novel, The Three Musketeers, and their slogan, one for all and all for one. Now, D'Artagnan had only 3 musketeers. In the alliance, there are 28, and no one should dare to break our fences. Thank you for your attention.